Rogers, former Indianapolis Speedway champion, is at the wheel for the test run of the first jet-powered car built in America. Ideal's Robot Commando.
It's the spacemen that steal the headlines.
The 1960s promised flying cars and robot maids, but not everything made it past the blueprint. For every moon landing, there were dozens of flops left behind in basements, landfills, and forgotten catalogs. These failed items from the 1960s were strange, brilliant, and doomed from the start. So imagine this. It is 1961, and you are cruising down the road in what looks like a spaceship on two wheels. That was the dream Ford tried to sell with the Gyron. It was a futuristic concept car that did away with four wheels entirely. Instead, it balanced on just two, using a gyroscope, yes, like the kind in science fiction movies. There were no pedals, no steering wheel, and barely any chance you would be able to drive it. But man, did it look cool. The body was sleek, all sharp angles and bubble domes, and it screamed speed even though it never actually hit the highway. Ford hyped it up big at car shows, but behind the curtains everyone knew it was all show and no go. The technology just was not there. The gyroscope was hard to manage, and the car itself was so unstable it needed little kickstands when parked. It never made it past the showroom floor. The original prototype? Destroyed in a fire. The Gyron did not just fail, it vanished. But that did not stop companies from continuing their obsession with the future. In fact, the very next year, one of them tried to bring the future into your living room. You just needed an extra $1,000 and a lot of patience. Enter the Sony CV2000. This was supposed to be the next big leap in home entertainment, a video recorder you could use at home long before VHS was a thing. It sounds amazing, right? Until you realize this beast was massive, heavy, and cost more than most people's cars at the time. We are talking over $1,000 in 1960s money, which is a good chunk of a year's salary for the average person. But price was just one problem. The CV2000 used reel-to-reel videotape, and even getting it to work with your television set was a gamble. It only recorded in black and white. You had to plug in a separate camera, adjust the knobs just right, and cross your fingers. If anything went wrong, and it often did, you were stuck. Playback was spotty, the tapes jammed constantly, and editing footage? Forget it. For a product meant to bring television magic into your home, it mostly just brought headaches. And despite being the first of its kind, it quietly faded into obscurity, beaten later by cheaper, easier options. But you know what still had people gathering around the television back then? A wild piece of gear that looked like it came straight off a flying saucer. The Philco Predicta. You remember that thing? That television set with the spinning head and the see-through shell that looked like it belonged in a Jetsons episode. It debuted in the late 1950s, but the last run of models pushed into the early 1960s, and by then it had one foot out the door. See, people bought the Predicta for the design. The space-age look, the swivel screen, the way it could sit on a pole or wall mount. It was a vibe. But what they got? Tubes that burned out constantly, finicky knobs, and a screen that would sometimes go blank just for the fun of it. Philco's idea was ahead of its time, no doubt. But it turns out no one really wants their television to look cool if it can barely hold a signal. Repair guys hated them. Parts were a nightmare. And while collectors might treasure them today, back then the Predicta's final models flopped so hard they helped tank the company. But hey, if your television was broken, you still had the stars to look forward to, or so you thought. Because in 1969, Pan American Airlines launched a waiting list for commercial flights to the moon. No joke. People were lining up to get their names on this list. The idea was simple. We made it to the moon, so the next logical step was to sell tickets. Over 90,000 people signed up, excited about the idea of sipping martinis in zero gravity and watching the Earth rise outside their window. And Pan Am treated it like a real thing. They issued membership cards, called it the First Moon Flights Club, and promised that when the day came, they would call. The only problem? There was no plan, no actual timeline, no spaceship. It was a publicity stunt that spiraled out of control. People bought into the dream hard, and Pan Am was not about to correct them. When the company went bankrupt in the 1980s, it had never even started building anything to take people to space. The dream fizzled out, but it proved just how hungry the world was for a taste of the future. And nowhere was that hunger more obvious than in people's homes, where they tried to bring cinema magic to life with a machine the size of a small refrigerator. Colorama slide projectors were supposed to make your family photos look like something out of a movie theater. They were huge, clunky, and came with screens big enough to fill a living room wall. This was not your average carousel projector. Coloramas used large format slides and massive bulbs to blast your vacation pictures across the room. Sounds cool until you realize they overheated in minutes, made a ton of noise, and burned through bulbs faster than you could say smile. The upkeep was outrageous. The slides were expensive, fragile, and nearly impossible to store without getting scratched. And sure, Dad might have loved showing off your trip to Niagara Falls on a 10-foot screen, but by the third slide, everyone in the room was bored, hot, and half blind from the glare. The thing is, people were obsessed with gadgets that made them feel like they were living in a sci-fi future. So companies doubled down, pushing even stranger inventions into people's homes. And if you thought a living room projector was extreme, wait until you hear about the car that needed a pilot's license just to turn the ignition. If you have ever seen a car and thought, this needs more fins, chrome, and maybe a rocket engine, then General Motors had your back in 1959 with the Firebird 3. It pushed its weird legacy into the 1960s, and boy, did it push hard. This thing looked like a jet fighter got stuck halfway through transforming into a convertible. It had 7 fins, a clear bubble cockpit, and joystick controls. Yes, a joystick, no steering wheel. The idea was to let drivers feel like pilots. They even threw in an onboard computer named UniControl that would help manage the car's systems. But here is the kicker. This spaceship on wheels never left the showroom. The tech was laughably overcomplicated for its time. The joystick was hard to control. The computer, basically just blinking lights and a fancy name. No one could actually drive it safely, and the general public wanted something that could, fit in a parking spot. The Firebird 3 lived its entire life as a museum piece, a rolling prop from a future that never arrived. Still, it looked cool. And back then, looking cool was half the battle. If only they put that much energy into something practical, like, say, communicating with someone across town. But as it turns out, even that was not so simple. Enter the early Motorola pager. The idea was amazing. A small device you could clip to your belt, and when someone needed you, it would beep. Revolutionary, except it barely worked. The first commercial pagers rolled out in the early 1960s, and they were supposed to change everything. But the range was horrible. In most cities, they only worked in a few downtown zones. If you stepped too far outside, say goodbye to your connection. Not to mention, these early pagers were clunky little bricks with antennas sticking out and batteries that drained faster than a flashlight on Halloween. Oh, and the signal was only one way. You got a page, but you could not respond unless you found a payphone. So really, you were just being told to go call someone, urgently, without any context. In hospitals or offices, it sort of made sense. But for everyday people, it was just a noisy gadget that told you nothing and helped even less. Still, it laid the groundwork for communication on the go. But speaking of on the go, let us talk about one of the weirdest, most unnecessary attempts at portable food ever invented. And trust me, you could not wash this one down with coffee. Instant breakfast cubes. They sound like something a time traveler would pack, right? Small, compact cubes that supposedly gave you a full breakfast with just a few chews. One flavor even promised the taste of bacon and eggs. The marketing pitch? Pure convenience. No cooking, no cleanup, just pop it in your mouth and start your day. But here is the thing. Nobody wants to chew their pancakes. These things were dry, chalky, and tasted like someone crammed a greasy diner into a vitamin pill. Most people had to drink water just to get them down. Plus, they were weirdly expensive. The kind of price tag that made you say, I could buy real food instead. Families tried them once for the novelty, and then shoved them in the back of the pantry where they sat until the expiration date. The only people who mildly enjoyed them were hikers and doomsday preppers. And even they admitted it was more about storage than taste. What made it worse? The cubes melted in the heat and crumbled in your pocket. Breakfast was not supposed to feel like a science experiment, but that did not stop companies from trying to futurize every part of the day, including how you made a phone call from your car. So let us talk about telex car phones, the early kind. These were supposed to be the peak of convenience, your own private phone line inside your car. Sounds slick, right? Except using one felt like yelling into a toaster that barely heard you. The equipment alone took up half your trunk, with clunky transceivers and roof antennas that made your car look like a spy van. You would pick up the phone, wait for a signal, and then shout into the handset while everyone in traffic stared at you like you were calling from the moon. Reception? Spotty on the best of days. Dropouts were constant, and unless you were in the middle of a major city, the odds of actually getting through were slim to none. Add to that the price tag, which could run higher than the car itself, and it becomes pretty clear why telex car phones never caught on. Not to mention, you had zero privacy. People in the next lane could hear your entire conversation. It was supposed to be the future, but it felt more like a prank. Still, if we are talking about future flops, nothing tops the brief moment in time where Hertz thought regular folks might fly to work. And no, that is not a metaphor. Hertz actually promoted a real jetpack. The rent-a-car rocket belt was a short-lived idea cooked up in the 1960s when the space craze had everyone thinking the future meant flying through the sky instead of driving on boring roads. Hertz partnered with Bell Aerosystems, who had built a functioning rocket belt for the military. The campaign imagined businessmen renting jetpacks to bypass traffic. The belt could fly for 20 seconds. That was it. And it guzzled hydrogen peroxide like it was soda. The cost was ridiculous, and let us not even talk about safety. There was no steering. You just blasted up, prayed for balance, and hoped you landed somewhere near your destination. As a promo stunt, it was electric. Everyone wanted to try it. But in the real world, it was a lawsuit waiting to happen. It never left the testing phase, and Hertz quickly backed off before someone got launched into a telephone pole. But hey, it was not the only time the 1960s gave kids access to something wildly unsafe, because our next entry is a toy that somehow got approved for the shelves, even though it came with a built-in heating plate. Let's not pretend it was ever going to work. The Hertz Rent-A-Car Rocket Belt promo was pure space-age wishful thinking. It was 1966, and Hertz thought, what if the average American didn't just rent a car, but rented a rocket? The pitch was that you could skip traffic and soar through the skies with a rented jetpack. They partnered with Bell Aerosystems, who had a functioning rocket belt prototype used in military demonstrations. On paper, incredible. In practice, a disaster waiting to happen. The belt could only fly for about 20 seconds on a full tank. You would rise up, wobble like a balloon in a windstorm, and slam back down, if you were lucky. It burned through fuel fast, cost tens of thousands of dollars, and had the directional control of a runaway firecracker. Still, the image was unforgettable. A businessman in a suit flying to work over the morning commute. Hertz ran with it for a minute, then quietly dropped it when they realized, the laws of physics still existed. This was less of a transportation idea and more of a comic book scene. And while it disappeared almost instantly, it left behind a legacy of American companies trying way too hard to predict the future. Speaking of which, there's nothing like building a revolutionary new format for home entertainment, only to have it fail not once, but twice. The RCA video disc prototype, first developed in 1969, was one of those ideas that kept coming back, no matter how badly it flopped the first time. The concept was groundbreaking. A flat disc that played video, kind of like a record but for movies. RCA called it the Select-A-Vision. In theory, this could bring cinema-level entertainment into the average American living room. It did not use lasers like compact discs or DVDs, it used a stylus needle like a phonograph. And it worked, when it worked. But it was fragile, incredibly prone to skipping, and the stylus wore out fast. RCA kept pouring money into it, convinced it was the future. Problem was, by the time it actually launched in the early 1980s, VHS and Betamax were already taking over. The video disc was outdated before it even hit store shelves, and while RCA had high hopes, it became a joke in tech circles. A perfect example of spending millions to build a product nobody wanted. Twice. But if you think that was bold, just wait until you hear about the company that thought aluminum walls and sliding panels would make people want to live like robots. Enter the Alcoa Forecast House 2000, a home made entirely of aluminum. Built in the 1960s as a glimpse into the house of the future, it was flashy, futuristic, and absolutely not cozy. The idea was that this would be the standard American home by the year 2000. Every surface gleamed. Every room was made with lightweight metals. The roof had solar panels. The appliances were built into the walls. It had sliding partitions instead of doors, and even the furniture looked like it had been welded in a laboratory. To be fair, it was impressive for a trade show. But when it came time for regular folks to imagine actually living in it, not so much. The place felt more like a spaceship than a family home. It echoed. It was cold. And heaven help you if you tried to lean back on one of those metal couches. Aluminum may have been the future of flight, but it was not the future of comfort. Alcoa quickly realized no one was lining up to buy one. And while it got a few museum exhibits and magazine features, the Forecast House faded into history as one of those cool ideas that just never found its audience. But one thing did find its audience: instant photography. That is, until Polaroid got a little too clever for its own good. Now, Polaroid's 360 land camera should have been a hit. Polaroid was already flying high in the 1960s. Everyone loved the idea of snapping a photo and watching it develop in real time. The 360 model took things up a notch. It had electronic flash support, a fancy focusing system, and loads of bells and whistles. It was supposed to be the professional-grade Polaroid, perfect for serious photographers and advanced hobbyists. Problem was, nobody asked for that. The 360 was bulky, expensive, and relied on complicated battery packs that drained faster than the flash could charge. Half the time, the film jammed. The focusing system required a steady hand and an engineer's patience. And even if you got everything to work, the pictures were not that much better than the simpler models. Most families just wanted something quick and easy for birthdays and vacations, not a camera that made you feel like you were defusing a bomb. Eventually, Polaroid wised up and leaned back into simplicity. The 360? It got shelved. But hey, if complicated tech was the name of the game, nobody played it harder than the company that tried to sell smart robots to kids. Robots that mostly just spun in place. Meet the Zeroids. These little battery-powered space robots were the toy store darlings of the late 1960s. They came in shiny chrome colors, had blinking lights, and were advertised as intelligent space companions from another galaxy. Ideal Toy Company pushed them hard, promising a whole line of robot helpers that could perform missions, carry cargo, and respond to their environment. What they actually did was drive in circles, fall over, and occasionally make beeping sounds if you were lucky. Kids thought they were getting the future of artificial intelligence. What they got was a shiny plastic brick with tiny wheels and a bad sense of direction. The battery life was a joke. The gears jammed constantly. And if the carpet was even slightly fluffy, forget it. Your Zeroid was going nowhere. But hey, it looked cool on the shelf. Parents bought them by the dozen for Christmas, but most ended up buried in toy boxes by January. Still, the dream of bringing futuristic tech into everyday life was alive and well. In fact, the very next year, people lined up at the World's Fair to try something even wilder, making a video call face-to-face from a phone booth. Back in 1964, people at the World's Fair lined up to see the future of communication, and AT&T's picture phone looked like it was going to change everything. A telephone with video. It was the Jetsons come to life. People could now talk and see each other through a small screen mounted to a bulky telephone unit. The demo had two booths, one in New York, the other in Disneyland. You would call, see the person's face, and chat. It was groundbreaking. But when it left the showroom and entered the real world, everything fell apart. For starters, it only worked if the person you were calling had the exact same setup, and the only locations that had them were in major cities, often inside specially built booths, not exactly home-friendly. To make things worse, it charged by the minute, not cents, dollars. That added up fast, especially for grainy black and white video that froze if someone even breathed wrong. Businesses gave it a shot. Nobody else did. By the time the technology was actually ready to work, the public had already moved on. The picture phone is a perfect example of a future idea that arrived too early, cost too much, and confused the people it was meant to wow. Still, if you thought that was dangerous, just wait until you hear about the toy that let kids play mad scientist, in the most literal way possible. Ah yes, Sinclair's home chemistry lab sets. Nothing says wholesome childhood fun like handing 10-year-olds real acids, flammable powders, and the ability to create small explosions in the garage. In the early 1960s, these kits were everywhere. Marketed as educational, they were part science, part spectacle. Kids could grow crystals, mix glowing liquids, and experiment with reactions that would make any science teacher twitch. But the truth? These kits were a ticking time bomb. Figuratively and sometimes literally. They included potassium nitrate, sulfur, and other compounds that today would be locked in a school lab under triple-sealed storage. There were instructions for creating mini smoke bombs, acids that could burn through metal, and even chemical reactions that, if mixed incorrectly, could send a glass beaker flying across the room. Lawsuits started piling in. So did safety warnings. By the end of the decade, the most dangerous sets were pulled from shelves, and future versions were watered down to the point of being glorified food coloring. Still, for a brief window of time, American kids had access to a fully stocked chemical arsenal. But if you think a little sulfur was intense, you should smell what came next. And no, it wasn't roses. Aquanet's scented hairspray line hit the shelves in 1968, hoping to combine the hold of a hair helmet with the charm of a perfume ad. The brand was already a household name. By then, Aquanet had glued more bouffants in place than any other product on the market. But someone in marketing must have thought, you know what this cloud of chemicals needs? Flowers. So they rolled out a special line of floral-scented versions. There were rose, jasmine, even a spring breeze blend. The idea was to give users a refreshing, elegant aroma while locking their hairstyle in place for hours. But it backfired, fast. The floral notes clashed with every other scent in a person's routine. The smells mixed into something that made elevators unbearable. To make matters worse, the scent faded quickly, leaving behind the signature Aquanet chemical musk, just with a weird dying flower twist. Even die-hard Aquanet fans could not justify it. By the early 1970s, the line quietly disappeared from shelves. Aquanet stuck around, but its foray into fragrance was a short and smelly detour. But if you want a true example of how the 1960s misunderstood its audience, just look at the British bike that tried to win over American teens by shrinking everything they loved. The Molten bicycle looked like it came from a science fiction movie. With tiny wheels, full suspension, and a weirdly upright riding position, it was a complete departure from the long-framed, big-wheeled Schwinn's that dominated American backyards. In the United Kingdom, the Molten was considered innovative, perfect for city riding, easy to fold, and ultra-modern. So, naturally, they tried to bring it to the States. Problem was, American kids wanted freedom, not function. They wanted to feel like rebels, cruising down hills with tassels flying and banana seats bouncing. The Molten looked like something your science teacher would ride. It was also hard to customize, and parts were not always easy to replace. Plus, the small wheels made it slower and more awkward on the gravel and dirt roads common in suburban neighborhoods. British engineering might have had its fans, but it just was not what American kids were looking for. The Molten faded from memory, tucked away like an unused geometry set. Still, there was one other thing from that decade that felt equally futuristic and almost equally useless. Believe it or not, there was a time when people thought groceries would arrive by pneumatic tube. Yes, you heard that right. In the 1960s, a few optimistic designers pitched pneumatic tube delivery systems for homes. You have seen these things at banks, air-powered tubes that shoot your papers to a teller and back. Now imagine that concept built into your house. The idea was that grocery stores, dry cleaners, and even your local pharmacy could shoot small deliveries straight to your kitchen, pantry, or garage through a series of underground or wall-installed tubes. It sounded cool. It looked cool in ads. But it was absolutely impractical. First of all, the system was noisy, like jet engine in your wall noisy. It also jammed constantly. Maintenance was a nightmare. If a tube broke, you had to dig up your lawn or tear down a wall. Unsurprisingly, the whole thing vanished by the 1970s, remembered more as a design quirk than a real innovation. But it goes to show how eager people were to bring the future home, no matter how ridiculous it was. And speaking of things no one really asked for, the next item on our list is a doll from 1964 that was supposed to be Ken's best buddy. Too bad nobody liked him. Say hello to Alan, Barbie's forgotten friend. He was introduced in 1964 as Ken's buddy, because apparently Ken needed someone to hang out with who was not Barbie. On paper, the concept made sense. Barbie had an ever-expanding circle of friends, so why not give Ken some backup? Alan was supposed to be relatable, down to earth, and, oddly enough, marketed as a doll that could wear all of Ken's clothes. That was literally on the box. But while Barbie was off driving convertibles and wearing glittery ball gowns, Alan came packaged with a questionable smile, an average outfit, and not much else. He did not come with a cool job. He did not have a signature style. Kids were not impressed. To make matters worse, he was often confused with Ken himself, just with slightly different hair. Sales were dismal. Mattel quietly pulled him from shelves not long after, though he did pop up again briefly in the 1990s for collectors. Even the name Alan lacked that spark kids looked for in a toy. But speaking of things that looked good on paper and felt awful in reality, let's talk about a fashion idea that was supposed to revolutionize your wardrobe until it literally made people itch. In the 1960s, Teflon-coated clothing was advertised as the future of fashion. Imagine a shirt that never wrinkled, pants that repelled stains like magic, and suits that stayed crisp all day. No dry cleaner needed. Sounds incredible, right? That was the dream. But the reality? Teflon felt like wearing plastic wrap. The material was stiff, weirdly slick, and made a quiet but constant swooshing noise every time you moved. Not only did it lack breathability, but it also had the unfortunate effect of making every outfit look a little off. Shirts hung awkwardly, pants felt like they were lined with kitchen foil, and anything in direct sunlight turned into a portable oven. Even worse, Teflon lost its coating after a few washes, meaning that permanent protection was not all that permanent. It did make a few comebacks in later decades, mainly in sportswear and lab gear, but as a mainstream fashion trend in the 1960s, it flopped hard. Still, at least you could take those clothes off. One thing you could not escape back then? Board games that looked great on the shelf but turned into confusing messes once you opened the box. Let us talk about the Beatles' Yellow Submarine board game, a visually wild product that was part merchandise, part acid trip. Based on the 1968 animated movie, the board was covered in psychedelic art, funky illustrations, and bright swirling colors. Kids begged for it. Beatles fans picked it up just to have it. The box looked amazing, but inside? Chaos. The rules were vague at best and completely nonsensical at worst. It involved moving pieces around a multicolored board with no real structure. Objectives were unclear. Scoring made no sense. Most of the instructions boiled down to just roll and move, maybe sing a song. It was the kind of game that started strong with excitement and ended with someone flipping the board and walking away. The pieces looked cool, but they did not fit well into the slots. But while that may have been a misstep in entertainment, the government had its own expensive miss around the same time, a high-stakes satellite launch that burned out before it could even help forecast the weather. The Nimbus 1. Weather satellite was supposed to change how we tracked storms, predicted rainfall, and prepared for hurricanes. It was launched in 1964 as part of a brand new NASA program to bring space-age precision to weather forecasting. It cost millions. It took years to develop, and it stopped working after 16 days. The satellite went into orbit and began transmitting data, but almost immediately, systems began to fail. Power issues, camera malfunctions, and thermal regulation problems all stacked up fast. Eventually, it just shut down, silent, useless, and floating. Scientists managed to scrape some useful images from it, but it was a drop in the bucket compared to what they had promised. That said, Nimbus 1 was the first in a long line of weather satellites, and its successors eventually became incredibly effective. But at the time, the launch was a flop. Newspapers barely covered it, the public lost interest, and officials quietly moved on to the next version. It was one of those big government projects that nobody remembers, not because it did nothing, but because it did not do enough to matter. Still, at least it tried to push boundaries. Meanwhile, back on Earth, one of the most iconic car brands tried to do the same, and American buyers wanted none of it. You know Volkswagen for its Beetle, right? Cute, round, reliable. That car was a post-war hit, so Volkswagen figured, hey, why not make something a little more upscale? Enter the Volkswagen Type 3. Fastback, a sleeker model with a longer body, better features, and a look that aimed for class over quirk. It hit the US market in the mid-1960s and hoped to win over buyers who wanted something a step up from the basic Beetle. But Americans had different ideas. When they looked at Volkswagen, they expected simple, cheap, and friendly, not refined and serious. The Fastback was caught in the middle. It was not luxurious enough to compete with American-made sedans, and it was too expensive and plain to pull people away from muscle cars or stylish imports. The engine was underwhelming. The rear storage space was awkward. But hey, not all branding experiments go well. Just ask the next company on our list, the one that tried to turn Barbie's boyfriend into a party guest and wound up with the loneliest doll in the toy aisle. The 1980s really wanted men to care about gloves. Not work gloves, not winter gloves, but luxury comfort gloves. Enter Isotoner. They were supposed to be the Cadillac of handwear, sleek, stretchy, and backed by none other than Dan Marino himself. Yes, that Dan Marino. The glove was featured in ads where Marino would flash his hands like they were national treasures. The pitch was simple: your hands deserve respect. The reality? Nobody was asking for this. These gloves were fine, but they were not revolutionary, and certainly not life-changing. Isotoner's massive ad campaign made the product feel overhyped and weirdly intimate. Like, why is Dan Marino caressing his own hands like that? It was one of those rare cases where the marketing machine worked too hard and ended up making the product feel silly. Plus, most people buying gloves in the 1980s were not doing it because of a sports endorsement. They were doing it because it was snowing. And if you think that is strange, just wait until we revisit one of the most dangerous playground toys to ever roll out of a toy aisle. Spoiler, it has no handles, no brakes, and absolutely no chill. Smoking in hospital waiting rooms feels like something out of a bad movie script now, but in the 1970s it was completely real. You could walk into a hospital, sit down under a bright no smoking sign, light a cigarette, and no one would bat an eye. Nurses did it, doctors did it, patients waiting for surgery did it. Visitors lit up next to vending machines and hospital gift shops. And yes, this was a hospital, a place people went to get better. But the air in the waiting room was thick enough to slice. People genuinely believed smoking helped ease nerves, even if they were in a place surrounded by oxygen tanks and respiratory therapists. There were ashtrays on every table and smoke curling up into the fluorescent lights. If someone had a baby in the maternity wing, you celebrated with a smoke right there in the lobby. It was considered a form of hospitality. Some hospitals even had designated smoking lounges, like it was an airport. The irony is hard to ignore. Of course, as the science caught up and lawsuits started piling in, hospitals began banning indoor smoking. What seemed normal was finally recognized as dangerous, not just to the smoker but everyone around them. Nowadays, the idea of someone sparking up in a hospital sounds like a public health emergency. But back then, it was just part of the scenery. And if you think that's wild, wait until you hear what kind of errands kids were running for their parents no identification card required. The Polaroid camera was magic encapsulated. A click, a whir, and moments later, a memory in your hand. Introduced in 1948, it brought instant gratification to photography, a novelty in an era of waiting and anticipation. It was the party favorite, the keeper of candid moments, long before instant became a standard expectation. As digital photography and smartphones transformed our capturing and sharing of moments, the Polaroid's prominence dimmed. Yet, in a twist of fate, the digital age's ephemera has revived a longing for the tangible, catapulting the Polaroid back into the limelight. Its resurgence speaks to our desire to hold on to moments, to make the fleeting a bit more permanent. The Polaroid camera, once a relic, now serves as a bridge between the past's charm and the present's pace, reminding us that some memories deserve more than just a digital footprint. Plastic furniture with built-in radios was peak. Just because we can does not mean we should. These chairs, stools, and side tables looked like props from a retro sci-fi movie. Hard plastic shells in off-white, beige, or faux wood grain, complete with embedded AM/FM radios. That's right, you could sit down and tune in at the same time. It sounded futuristic, it looked modern, and it absolutely flopped. Why? For starters, plastic furniture is not comfortable. Add speakers into the mix, and suddenly you are vibrating with every song. Not in a cool bass drop way either, more like your spine buzzing because someone turned up the Eagles. The sound quality was garbage. The controls were always in the most awkward places, on the armrest, under the cushion, or worse, on the back panel where you had to stand up just to switch stations. Static? Constant. Comfort? None. Functionality? Debatable at best. By the early 1990s, they were toast, relics of a design phase that tried too hard to be ahead of the curve. And speaking of trying way too hard, the 1980s gave us a movie adaptation that should have stayed on trading cards, and trust us, it was gross in more ways than one. Biking in the 1970s was a full-body commitment to chaos. You grabbed your bike, usually a hand-me-down with faded paint and maybe a card clipped to the spokes, and hit the road. No helmet, no reflective gear. Most of the time, not even shoes. Kids would ride barefoot through gravel and glass like they were immune to injury. If you had sneakers on, you were overdressed. The banana seat was your throne, and your kingdom was every cracked sidewalk and pothole-filled alley in town. No one talked about concussions. Helmets were something you only saw in the Olympics or in comic books. You fell, you bled, you got back on. And this was not just a neighborhood thing. Some kids would bike across entire towns to visit friends or buy candy from the gas station. You might have a baseball card flapping in the spokes and a backpack full of nothing but a peanut butter sandwich and dreams. It was reckless, it was wild, and it was glorious. But if you think biking without shoes was bold, wait until you remember how families traveled together, jammed shoulder to shoulder in a station wagon with zero seatbelts in sight. Step into the past, where the glow of a jukebox illuminated faces in diners and bars, setting the soundtrack of countless memories. In the golden decades of the 50s and 60s, jukeboxes played the role of a communal music platform, where the drop of a coin could dictate the night's rhythm. These icons of music history created shared moments and collective memories, making music a journey navigated together, one selection at a time. Although the digital age has reshaped our listening habits, the essence of the jukebox endures in places that celebrate nostalgia, serving as a beacon of a time when music was a collective experience that united us in melody and moment. Max Headroom was supposed to be the future, a computer-generated, sarcastic television host who stuttered stylishly and wore sunglasses at night. He was the face of a dystopian digital world, equal parts cyberpunk icon and artificial intelligence with an attitude. Advertisers loved him, especially soda companies, so someone had the bright idea. Let us give him a full television series. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. The Max Headroom show was visually interesting but narratively confusing. It tried to blend science fiction with satire, wrapped in glitchy editing and background noise. Most of the time, you were not sure if the show was broken or just being artsy. The plotline featured underground hackers, corrupt corporations, and a bleak media landscape, which ironically kind of predicted the internet. And Max, once a futuristic face of advertising, became more of a trivia answer at bar night. Still, his influence stuck around in weird ways. You can spot traces of Max Headroom in everything from video game villains to pop music videos. And if you thought that was sensory overload, wait until we talk about the time theaters tried to make movies smell like real life. Kids buying cigarettes for their parents was so casual in the 1970s that store clerks barely even looked up. You could be 7 years old, barely tall enough to see over the counter, and still walk out with a pack of cigarettes tucked into your pocket. No ID, no questions, no raised eyebrows. All you needed was a note from your mom. And half the time, not even that. "A pack of Virginia Slims, please. My dad wants the soft pack." That was a perfectly acceptable sentence coming from a child. Some kids even took pride in knowing their parents' brand. They could identify a Marlboro from a mile away. They knew which cigarettes had menthol, which ones had filters, and which ones were cheapest. It was like a weird rite of passage. One day you're playing with building blocks, the next you're sent to the corner store to keep your dad's addiction going. Most kids did not even think it was strange. It was just one more chore on the list. Back then, cigarettes were everywhere. Commercials, restaurants, even cartoons sometimes. So the idea of kids buying them did not seem too far-fetched. But once public health started catching up and laws began to change, this practice faded fast. These days, a cashier would get fired, maybe even fined, for selling to someone underage. Back in the 1970s, it was just another Wednesday. Of course, if your parents did not feel like sending you to the store, they might just thumb it themselves. Let's talk about the golden age of hitchhiking and why it vanished so fast. The typewriter, with its rhythmic tap-tap and the ceremonial ding at the end of a line, was the soul of written communication. From Mark Twain to the Beat Poets, it was the instrument of choice for crafting narratives. The introduction of electric models, like the IBM Selectric in the 20th century, was akin to moving from a horse-drawn carriage to a sleek automobile. Yet, the dawn of personal computing in the late 20th century gently ushered this stalwart into the shadows. Still, the typewriter remains a symbol of creativity and nostalgia, cherished by those who yearn for the tangible imprint of ink on paper. Selling lawn darts at toy stores was, without exaggeration, a decision made by people who had never thrown one themselves. These weren't soft plush toys. These were literal missiles with metal tips, marketed as a family-friendly backyard game. Toss them high in the air, try to land them in a circle, and try not to take out someone's eye in the process. And in the 1970s, it worked like a charm. Every summer, Block Party had them. Every kid had a cousin who ended up with a dart embedded in the ground 2 inches from their foot. It was all fun and games until, well, it wasn't. But the real excitement came from the absolute unpredictability of where those things would land. Wind gust, curveball, unsteady grip, friendly fire, toddlers waddling through the yard during a game? Not ideal. Maybe because they figured a few scratches built character? Maybe because they were busy chain smoking or flipping burgers on the grill. Either way, these darts stayed in circulation far longer than common sense should have allowed. Eventually, injuries, and we're talking serious ones, piled up. Hospital visits, emergency surgeries, lawsuits, the whole deal. And in the late 1980s, the government finally banned the sale of lawn darts for good. But if you grew up in the 1970s, there's a solid chance you knew someone who had them, or threw them, or got grazed by one. And yet, they were just another Saturday afternoon in the yard. Now imagine playing with weapons disguised as toys while your parents smoked indoors with the doctor's approval. Yeah, that was a thing too. Laserdisc karaoke machines for home use were the audio equivalent of bringing a jet engine to a dinner party. These bulky systems promised a high-tech singing experience complete with massive laser discs that looked like vinyl records from the future. They came with tiny microphones, video lyrics, and a catalog of songs that somehow made every living room feel like a karaoke bar at 2 a.m., and not in a good way. The disc-changing process was awkward. The song selection was dated even for the time, and the video footage that played behind the lyrics often looked like someone filmed it in a dentist's waiting room. The microphones were low quality, the volume controls were chaotic, and the speakers distorted your voice into a shrill echo that could wake the neighbors. And not in a fun, come join us way. They were expensive, heavy, and quickly became outdated once smaller, sleeker, and more user-friendly CD-based systems rolled in. But if you thought singing poorly to a crowd of annoyed relatives was bad, imagine trying to impress someone with your personality, through perfume that matched your horoscope sign. The VCR, a marvel that arrived in the 1970s, was akin to a magician in a box, granting us the power to capture time itself. Suddenly, TV schedules no longer dictated our lives. We could record, rewind, and relive our favorite moments at will. The VCR was the herald of home cinema, a concept so revolutionary that even its hefty price tag couldn't dampen its allure. It's a testament to its impact that phrases like "be kind, rewind" are etched in the collective memory of a generation. As DVDs and streaming services emerged, the VCR's star faded, but its legacy of shaping family movie nights and introducing the world to video rentals lives on. Roller rinks in the 1970s were the ultimate hangout. You had the flashing lights, the disco ball, and enough polyester to start a fire just by walking. But the real wild card? The music. No one blinked when rinks blasted explicit disco tracks over the loudspeakers while underage kids zipped around with sticky slushies in hand. The lyrics were often loaded with innuendo, suggestive metaphors, or sometimes just straight-up raunchy lines. But hey, if it had a funky beat, it made the playlist. It was not about lyrics, it was about the vibe. You had 8-year-olds skating in a circle to songs that would raise eyebrows today at a high school dance. And this was not just some fringe rink in the middle of nowhere. This was normal. Parents sat in the stands eating nachos while Donna Summer or the Village People gave their best PG-13 performance. It was a time before clean edits, before parental warnings, before anybody really asked, "Hey, should we be playing this for kids?" Spoiler alert, nobody asked. But if you think that was questionable, let's talk about what came on the TV while kids were watching cartoons on a Saturday morning, right between episodes of Scooby-Doo and The Jetsons. Before the age of sleek athleisure and breathable fabrics, the 1980s gave us Diaglo workout gear. It was made from fluorescent neoprene, yes, that same thick, stretchy material you find in wetsuits, and it covered every inch of your body like your thighs owed someone money. Neon pink, electric green, traffic cone orange, you name it. Someone wore it to aerobics. The idea was to be bold, vibrant, and energetic. The result was usually something closer to a walking safety vest. These outfits were all over workout tapes, with instructors bouncing around in skin-tight ensembles that squeaked when they stretched. It made you sweat like you were jogging inside a microwave. And when you put it on, you looked less like a fitness enthusiast and more like someone who got lost on their way to a roller disco. Yet people bought them in droves, because the commercials promised that if you wore Diaglo, you were serious about your health and your fashion. But let's be real, it was more punishment than performance. Eventually, the trend burned out when everyone realized looking like a glow stick was not worth passing out mid-jumping jack. But if you thought sweating in neon was uncomfortable, just wait until we get into a home appliance that fizzled out almost as fast as it carbonated. Literally. Hitchhiking as a totally normal travel option was not just for free spirits or wandering poets in the 1970s. It was a legitimate mode of transportation. No car? No problem. Stick out your thumb and wait for a kind stranger to pull over. It was something teenagers, college students, and even older adults did all the time. You'd see someone standing on the side of the highway with a duffel bag, maybe a handwritten sign that said, "Headed north," and no one thought it was weird. For a while, it was even considered kind of romantic, like a symbol of trust in your fellow human. the kind of thing people wrote folk songs about. There were books, guides, and even safety tips passed around for successful hitchhiking. You learned the good spots to stand, how to look approachable, and what to do if someone creepy pulled over. Hitchhiking was not just accepted, it was encouraged in some circles. Some people even used it to get to and from work if the distance was not too crazy. But naturally, it did not stay sunshine and smiles forever. The danger was always there. It just took a while before it hit national headlines. As crime reports and horror stories started stacking up, people grew less trusting. Hitchhiking laws changed. Stranger danger campaigns launched. What was once seen as adventurous became straight-up risky. These days, sticking your thumb out on the highway is more likely to get you a side-eye than a ride. And while hitchhiking was fading into the rearview mirror, another threat was hiding in plain sight, tucked into every household's favorite household item. Let's talk about ironing board pads, specifically the kind lined with asbestos. In 1979, Sony unleashed a revolution that fit snugly into the pockets of a generation hungry for mobility: the Walkman. This wasn't just a device, it was a declaration of independence, allowing music to become a personal, portable experience. Suddenly, every walk to school, every bus ride, and every leisurely stroll had a soundtrack. The Walkman didn't just change how we listened to music, it changed where we listened, infusing the mundane with magic. As smartphones and streaming services emerged, the Walkman faded into the background, but not before it had indelibly changed our relationship with music. The legacy of the Walkman lives on in every smartphone's music app, a testament to the era when music first stepped out with us into the wide, wide world. In 1979, Sony unleashed a revolution that fit snugly into the pockets of a generation hungry for mobility: the Walkman. This wasn't just a device, it was a declaration of independence, allowing music to become a personal, portable experience. Suddenly, every walk to school, every bus ride, and every leisurely stroll had a soundtrack. The Walkman didn't just change how we listened to music, it changed where we listened, infusing the mundane with magic. As smartphones and streaming services emerged, the Walkman faded into the background, but not before it had indelibly changed our relationship with music. The legacy of the Walkman lives on in every smartphone's music app, a testament to the era when music first stepped out with us into the wide, wide world. Back before Halloween became a yearly anxiety fest, taking unmarked candy from a neighbor was just how the night worked. You rang a doorbell, yelled, "Trick or treat," and got handed whatever someone had lying around. Loose jelly beans? Great. Homemade fudge and wax paper? Even better. The idea that candy needed to be sealed and tamper-proof had not fully caught on yet. No one was worried about needles or poison. Your biggest fear was getting a box of raisins. Parents did not comb through your haul under a flashlight. They just told you not to eat it all at once. The neighbor handing out popcorn balls or wrapped caramels was not suspicious. They were the cool house. Trust was the currency of the neighborhood, and if someone put effort into a treat, you respected it. Now, we wrap everything in layers of packaging and double-check labels like candy is a security threat. And after all that sugar buzz, you already knew where the real party was, under a disco ball, skates on, and lyrics your parents probably should have listened to more closely. In the 1980s, a time when technology and fashion collided in vibrant ways, the calculator watch became the epitome of geek chic. These wrist-worn gadgets allowed for on-the-go calculations, a novelty that seemed almost sci-fi at the time. Despite their practicality, the rise of smartphones with built-in calculators and a plethora of other functions rendered these nifty devices more nostalgic than necessary. Yet, they remain a cherished relic of a time when wearing your tech on your sleeve, or rather, your wrist, was the height of cool. Calculator watches, in their quirky glory, symbolize a period when technology was becoming personal, portable, and, yes, even a fashion statement. The 1980s were He-Man's golden hour. The action figures, the cartoon, the castles, it all worked. until it did not. Enter the meteorbs. These were plastic eggs that transformed into robotic dinosaurs and beasts. Sounds cool in theory, right? Well, not exactly. They were a spin-off that nobody asked for and few even understood. The meteorbs came from outer space, at least according to the convoluted lore. And while He-Man's universe already had a lot going on, alien egg animals were a stretch too far. The figures were small, hard to transform, and did not mesh well with the bulkier, sword-wielding He-Man figures. You had warriors and sorcerers, and then a plastic orb that turned into a knockoff dragon. But the excitement faded quickly when kids realized these were more awkward than awesome. They were like the Happy Meal version of Transformers, but with less movement and more confusion. Even die-hard fans of Eternia looked at them and said, "I'm good." And speaking of complicated toys with a high learning curve, let us talk about the interactive television show that thought kids were ready to join a live-action sci-fi war from their living room. Back in the 1970s, asbestos was the miracle material nobody questioned. It was fireproof, heat-proof, durable, and completely packed into everyday items like ironing board pads. If you were ironing your Sunday best or pressing collars for school, chances are you were standing over a big square of asbestos without even knowing it. The logic back then was that if something could handle heat, it was good. And asbestos? It could handle just about anything, except your lungs. That stuff did not just stay in the pad. It crumbled, it flaked, it floated right up into the air and got breathed in over and over again. Still, no one thought twice. Moms would lean over the ironing board, kids running around, windows shut, and steam rising up like a sauna of danger. It was not until years later that we figured out those innocent little chores came with a free side of cancer risk. And speaking of leaving kids in questionable situations, sometimes they were not in the house at all. Sometimes they were left in the car, alone, with the windows rolled up. The boombox, a hefty symbol of the 80s music scene, carried more than just tunes. It carried an attitude. With its shoulder-perched silhouette, it declared music a communal experience, blaring the beats of hip-hop and rock into the streets and parks. Its arrival marked the democratization of music, pulling it out of living rooms and into public spaces. As personal listening devices became the norm, the boombox's prominence faded, but not its impact. Today, its spirit lives on in the portable Bluetooth speakers that soundtrack our picnics and beach outings. A nod to the era when music was not just heard, but felt, a tactile presence in the air around us. Smell-o-vision is one of those ideas that never needed to come back, but the 1980s brought it back anyway. Originally dreamed up decades earlier, it was the concept of pumping scents into a movie theater to match what was happening on screen. Think popcorn, flowers, burning rubber, and maybe a little regret. In the 1980s, a few studios tried to revive the concept with updated tech. Scratch and sniff cards were handed out before showtime, promising a full sensory experience. Spoiler alert, the cards smelled like crayons, the timing was always off, and half the audience forgot to scratch anything at all. Even more ambitious theaters installed actual scent machines that pumped artificial smells through the air vents. Which, fun fact, is exactly how you make a whole crowd nauseous during an action scene. Smell-o-vision failed because, unlike sound or visuals, scent is wildly subjective. And when it is artificial, it just smells like someone spilled perfume on a couch cushion. And speaking of odd inventions that had their moment before quietly disappearing, let us talk about the time schools had to ban a certain wrist gadget that made kids feel like geniuses. Before digital streaming platforms like Spotify, the audio cassette reigned supreme, offering a personal touch to music curation through the creation of mixtapes. Philips launched this innovative format in the 1960s, transforming cassettes into powerful means of expression beyond mere songs. Despite being overshadowed by CDs and MP3s, cassettes have seen a revival among those nostalgic for a tangible music experience. Mixtapes, meticulously assembled, symbolized affection and personal milestones, embodying the art of sharing music intimately. The ritual of rewinding tapes may have faded, but the essence of mixtapes endures. evoking a bygone era where music sharing was a thoughtful, personal gesture. Today, the audio cassette remains a beloved relic, celebrated for its role in crafting heartfelt musical narratives. Which of these 1960s flops do you secretly wish had taken off? Drop your favorite in the comments, tap like if you enjoyed the ride, and hit subscribe for more blasts from the past.